In the spring of 1943, the German High Command looked at a map of the Mediterranean and saw a certainty that was almost religious in its power. Sicily. The logic was airtight. Sicily was the only footstool in the Western Mediterranean. It was 90 miles from the Allied victory in Tunisia. It was the only place that made sense. Every German general, every Abwehr analyst, and Adolf Hitler himself knew that the main blow was coming there. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, received a document in early May that changed everything. It was a photographic copy of a personal letter from the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff to a commander in the field. It was marked top secret. It was not meant to be read by German eyes. And the man who read it, a PhD in law named Alexis von Rouen, the most professional analyst in the Third Reich, declared the document 100% authentic. He stakes his reputation on it. Based on that single piece of paper, Hitler issued a directive that moved an entire panzer division from France to Greece. He moved thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and dozens of aircraft away from the very island the Allies were about to hit. The most powerful intelligence apparatus in Europe had been outplayed by a dead man. But the real irony isn't that they believed a lie. It's the man they believed. The documents were found chained to the wrist of a British Marine officer named Major William Martin. He was, in the German files, a hero, a man of family, a man of love letters, a man with a fiancée. In reality, the man whose corpse carried those documents didn't have a single friend in the world. He didn't have a fiancée. He didn't even have a home. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He was a Welsh vagrant who had lived in the cracks of London society, invisible to everyone. He was 34 years old. He was a wanderer. And in January of 1943, he walked into a warehouse and ate a piece of bread smeared with rat poison because he was hungry enough to eat anything. British intelligence found him in a morgue. They took his body, which no one had come to claim, and they decided to give him the life he never had, so that they could use his death to win a cold-blooded calculation in the history of espionage. He remembered a plot from a detective novel. He proposed it to his superior. The idea was simple: drop a corpse into the sea, carrying documents that would leak the true secret invasion plans to the enemy. It was called Operation Mincemeat, and for it to work, they needed the perfect body. To understand Mincemeat, you have to understand the desperation of the Allied High Command in April of 1943. The war was at a pivot point. The Axis had been pushed out of Africa, but the fortress Europe was still standing. To break it, the Allies had to cross the sea. And to cross the sea, they needed a beach. Everyone but a bloody fool can see it has to be Sicily, Montgomery had once said. And he was right. The problem was simple. The Allies were preparing to invade Sicily. It was the obvious target. It was the only target. And the Germans knew it. If the Allies landed on a heavily defended Sicily, the beaches would become a slaughterhouse. To save thousands of lives, the British had to persuade Adolf Hitler that the target wasn't Sicily at all, to avoid an outcome that was being mapped by German artillery. Ewan Montagu, a naval barrister with a mind like a razor, was given the task of making the Germans believe the predictable was impossible. Montagu knew that you cannot just tell a lie to an intelligence service like the Abwehr. They are trained to smell a plant a mile away. If a briefcase washed up on a shore with plans for Greece written on it in large letters, the Germans would laugh. The lie had to be lost It had to be private. It had to be something that was never meant for German eyes. It couldn't be a report. It had to be a life. The idea had been floating around. Ian Fleming, the man who would later create James Bond, had mentioned it. Charles Cholmondeley of MI5 had refined it. But it was Montague who realized it needed more than just a body. It needed a soul. They needed a dead man who could walk through the German mind and convince them he was real. We must find a body, Montague wrote. If possible, a body that looks like an officer, and if possible, a body with no family to ask where it went. In the middle of the greatest war in human history, British intelligence went hunting for a man who had already lost everything. His name was Glyndwr Michael, and for 30 years after the war, history simply forgot he existed. He was born in Abwehr, Wales, in 1909. His father was a coal miner who took his own life. His mother followed years later. By 1943, Glyndwr was essentially a phantom. He had no fixed address. He lived on the streets of London, sleeping in warehouses, eating what he could find. In late January, he was found in a warehouse near King's Cross. He was unconscious. He had consumed phosphorus-based rat poison. Whether it was a final act of despair or a terrible accident of hunger, we will never know. He died in St. Pancras Hospital on January 28th. He was 34 years old. He weighed barely 140 pounds. He had no identification. No one came to visit him. He was a non-entity. To the state, he was a burden. To Ewan Montague, he was a miracle. Montague needed a body whose cause of death would pass for drowning under a Spanish post-mortem. Phosphorus poisoning, as it happens, causes a fluid buildup in the lungs that looks remarkably similar to what happens when you die at sea. He was the perfect candidate, Montague would later write, in a sentence that perfectly captures the cool pragmatism of wartime intelligence. Glyndwr Michael's body was moved to a refrigeration unit in Southwark. It was kept at a precisely controlled temperature. He was no longer a human being. He was Section Item 1. But Montague knew that a body alone wasn't enough. The Germans would look at his teeth. They would look at his hands. They would look at the way he was groomed. If they were going to turn a starving Welsh vagrant into a refined Royal Marines officer, they didn't just need a uniform. They needed a history. They began to build a persona called Major William Martin. They gave him a name that was common enough to be plausible. They gave him a service number. And then they gave him a reason to live. They gave him a woman, someone who was waiting for him, someone whose letters he would carry in his pocket until the very end. Against the background of a city that had been broken by the Blitz, a plan was being born. It was a plan so absurd, so macabre, that it could only have been conceived in the darkest corridors of British intelligence. They were going to go to war using a man who was already dead to become the most dangerous weapon in the British arsenal. But first, Ewan Montague had to write the love letters. The construction of Major William Martin's identity was, in Ewan Montague's own words, the most intricate piece of sustained fiction he had ever attempted. But as they built the man, they were also managing the body. While Montague was in his office, debating which theatre tickets to put in the wallet, the body of Glyndwr Michael was being moved from the morgue to a heavy steel canister. It was packed with dry ice. Every time they opened that canister to check the uniform or the fit of a boot, they were looking at the face of a man who had never asked to be a hero. Montague knew that to fool a trained Abwehr analyst, you don't just provide a document, you provide a mess. A real life is messy. It's full of unpaid bills, old ticket stubs, and the small, useless debris that gathers in a man's pockets. We must make him human, Montague said. But the irony was that, to make him human in the eyes of the Germans, they had to treat the real human in the box as a mannequin. The wallet of Major William Martin was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It contained a photograph of Pam, his fiancée. It contained a letter from Lloyd's Bank demanding payment of a £79 overdraft. It contained a stiff, disappointed letter from his father about the wisdom of marrying in haste. There was a receipt for an engagement ring from New Bond Street, 2 ticket stubs from a musical called Strike a New Note, a book of stamps, a used pencil. Every single item was a lie, but every item was chosen because it was ordinary. A forger thinks in grand gestures. A mastermind thinks in theater stubs and overdrafts. The bank letter was the genius stroke. Montague knew the Germans would think. No one would invent a debt. A hero is supposed to be perfect. By making William Martin a bit of a financial disaster, they made him unimpeachably real. But there was a problem they couldn't solve with paper. The boots. Glyndwr Michael had been a starving vagrant. His feet were not the feet of a well-off Royal Marines officer. To fix this, they had to put the officer's boots on the body and leave them there in the cold for weeks, just to make sure the leather settled in a way that looked natural. While they were building this vibrant, debt-ridden, engaged young man on paper, the physical reality was a silent, frozen Welshman in a Southwark basement. The persona was getting louder. The man was becoming a ghost. By the time the briefcase was ready, Major William Martin was more alive in the British files than many real officers. His handwriting had been practiced. His signature had been forged until it was fluid. He was a ghost born from a pen, and he was about to go to war. Of all the items in the wallet, the love letters from Pam were the most dangerous. They weren't written by a spy. They were written by a young woman in the office who was told to imagine she was in love with a man she would never meet. She wrote about a walk they had taken, about a joke they shared, about how she was worried he was working too hard. When you read these letters today, they are heartbreaking. They aren't dramatic. They are simple. They are the sound of 2 people trying to build a future while the world is on fire. The photograph of Pam showed her in a bathing suit, laughing. It was casual, unposed, the kind of picture a man looks at when he's alone in a cabin at sea. But here is the macabre truth. These letters, full of warmth and future plans, were being placed into the pocket of a man whose real life had been defined by a total absence of love. While Pam was writing to William about their wedding, the real man, Glyndwr, was lying in a metal canister, his skin turning grey in the dry ice. Montague noted that the contrast was unsettling. They were creating a beautiful romance to wrap around a tragedy. They were using the most sacred human emotion, love, as a delivery system for a lie that would kill thousands of Germans. The Germans would read those letters, and they would see a man who had everything to live for. They would see a life they couldn't possibly imagine was a fabrication. The deception worked because the love felt real, and the love felt real because it was the only thing in the briefcase that actually felt human. On April 19th, 1943, the persona and the body finally met for the last time. In a darkened room in London, Montague and Cholmondeley performed the final ritual. They dressed the body of Glyndwr Michael in the full uniform of a major in the Royal Marines. They placed the wallet in his pocket. They chained the briefcase to his wrist. The body was returned to the canister, which was now filled with data that could change the course of a war. It was loaded into a van and driven north to Scotland. At Holy Loch, the canister was carried aboard the submarine Seraph. The crew wasn't told what was inside. They were told it was highly sensitive meteorological equipment. But a submarine is a small place. The crew could feel the weight of it. They called it the Sardine. For 11 days, the Seraph moved through the Atlantic. Below deck, in the narrow, sweating corridors of the submarine, the canister sat near the torpedo tubes. The crew slept inches away from a dead man who was carrying a secret that Churchill himself was waiting for. On the morning of April 30th, the Seraph surfaced off the coast of Spain. The air was cold. The sea was calm. Lieutenant Commander Norman Jewell and a small group brought the canister up to the deck. They opened it. The smell of dry ice and the reality of a 3-month-old corpse hit the night air. Jewell read a few words from the Bible. Then they pushed the body of Major William Martin into the water. The tide was moving toward the shore. The wind was exactly as the meteorologists had predicted. Major Martin began his final mission. He floated in the darkness, his briefcase heavy at his side, drifting toward a beach where the entire German intelligence service was waiting to be fooled. As the Seraph submerged and disappeared, Glyndwr Michael was truly alone for the last time. He was a dead man, in a dead man's uniform, carrying a dead man's life toward a living war. Behind him, the sun began to rise over Spain. The fisherman was already preparing his nets. The trap was set. The Abwehr's analysts began their assessment. The conclusion, when it came, was unambiguous. The documents were genuine. When the body of Major William Martin was dragged onto the sand at Welsh, the clock started ticking for a man named Adolf Klaus. Klaus was the senior Abwehr agent in the region. He was a professional. He was suspicious by nature. When the Spanish authorities told him they had found a British officer with a briefcase chained to his wrist, Klaus didn't celebrate. He felt a cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. In his darkened office in Welsh, Klaus waited for the Spanish to let him see the documents. He knew the British would be screaming for their return. He knew every second counted. When the Spanish finally allowed him to photograph the contents, Klaus worked with a handheld camera under a single desk lamp. He looked at the personal letters. He looked at the photograph of the fiancée. It is too good to be true, he might have thought. But as he turned the pages, he saw the bank overdraft. He saw the theater tickets. He saw the human mess of Major Martin's life. Klaus made a choice. He cabled Berlin. His message was the first domino to fall. The documents appear to be of the highest importance. They are, in my assessment, genuine. By the time the British naval attaché in Madrid arrived to demand the briefcase back, Klaus had already sent the photographs to Berlin. He had just handed the German High Command the keys to the Mediterranean. He didn't know he had just signed the death warrant for the Nazi defense of Sicily. In the heart of Berlin, at the Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitzufer, the photographs of the documents from Spain were treated like a holy relic. The analysts there were the best in the world. They were men like Alexis von Roueny, a man who hated the British but respected their professionalism. He looked for the tiny mistakes. He looked for the wrong font. He looked for the tell. But there was no tell, because Montague hadn't just forged the paper. He had forged the soul. Rowan saw the letter from the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He saw the informal, slightly arrogant tone that senior British officers used with each other. He saw the mention of the Sicily cover. They are trying to trick us into thinking it is Sicily, Rowena concluded. Therefore, the real targets must be Sardinia and Greece. By the time the briefing reached Hitler's desk, the deception was no longer a theory. It was an established fact of German intelligence. Imagine the scene in the wolf's lair. Hitler is hunched over a massive map of Europe. His generals are pointing to Sicily. They are telling him the obvious. Hitler interrupts them. He throws the photographic copies of the mincemeat letters onto the map. "You are looking at the diversion," he says. His voice is certain. "The British are clumsy. They lost their plans in the sea. They are going to Greece. They are going to Sardinia. We will meet them there." With a single movement of his hand, Hitler orders the 1st Panzer Division to move. Hundreds of tanks begin to roll away from the one beach where they could have stopped the invasion. The Invisible Man from Wales had just moved a Nazi army. In a small, windowless room in London, Ewan Montague was reading the German mind. Thanks to the ultra-intercepts, the cracked Enigma codes, Montague could see exactly what his Major Martin was doing. He saw the orders for the Panzer divisions. He saw the U-boats being moved to the Aegean. "They've swallowed it," he whispered to Cholmondeley. "Hook, line, and sinker." But the tension was unbearable. For 2 months, the British had to watch and wait. Every day was a risk. What if a German spy in London saw a man who looked like the Major? What if the Spanish doctor performed a second autopsy? But the confirmation bias of the German High Command was their greatest ally. Once Hitler decided he was right, he stopped looking for evidence that he was wrong. He ignored the build-up of ships in North Africa. He ignored the reconnaissance flights over Sicily. He had the truth in his pocket. And the truth had been written by a barrister in an office over lunch. July 10th, 1943, 2:45 in the morning. Imagine you are Sergeant Joe Miller. You are huddled in a steel landing craft, 3 miles off the coast of Sicily. You can hear the roar of the engines. You can feel the cold salt spray on your face. You've been told this will be a bloodbath. You've seen the maps of the German defenses. You expect the sea to turn red the moment the ramp drops. You are shaking. Every man around you is silent, clutching a rifle, waiting for the screams. The ramp drops. You run into the water. You wait for the machine gun fire. You wait for the panzers to roar over the dunes. But there is nothing. The beach is eerily, terrifyingly quiet. A few scattered Italian units fire and then retreat. The massive counterattack you were promised never comes. You look at your lieutenant. He looks as confused as you are. "Where the hell are they?" he asks. They are 800 miles away. They are in the mountains of Greece, waiting for an invasion that will never happen. They are in Sardinia, guarding empty beaches. Because of a briefcase. Because of a Welshman. Because of a lie that was so perfect, the enemy chose to believe it over their own eyes. By the time the German command realized their mistake, it was too late. Sicily was lost. Mussolini was falling. The soft underbelly of Europe had been ripped open. After the war, the men who made mincemeat went back to their lives. Montague went back to the law. Cholmondeley went back to the civil service. They carried the secret for years. For 55 years, the grave was marked Major William Martin. People would visit. They would leave flowers for the British officer who died at sea. They would imagine his life, his fiancée Pam, his stiff father in Wales. They were mourning a ghost. In 1998, the truth was finally carved into the stone. Below the name of the fictional major, they added the name of the real man, Glyndwr Michael, the man who died alone in a warehouse, the man who had no one to claim him, the man who was Section Item 1. If there is a moral to this story, it is a hard one. It is that in war, the state can take everything from you, even your name, even your death, and turn it into a victory. But there is another way to look at it. Glyndwr Michael's real life was a tragedy of invisibility, but in his death, he became the ultimate protector. He stood between 40,000 Allied soldiers and the German guns. He walked into the heart of the Third Reich, and he lied for us. The man who never was turned out to be the man we needed most of all. In the silence of Huelva Cemetery, the tides still come in and go out. The sea that brought him to Spain is the same sea that brought the landing craft to Sicily. He is finally home, in his own grave, under his own name. The most successful spy in the history of the world was finally allowed to stop lying.